in auto racing, when you have teammates, I think at some point in time, no matter what, out of the season, a year, or even a race, you're going to have a teammate that you're going to ruffle his feather or you're going to ruffle theirs. So that makes the dynamic really hard. But at the end of the day, it's all about a team effort. And you don't want that to happen. The owner doesn't want it to happen, but inevitably it will happen at some point in time. And you do have to get over it and get on to the next race and try not to worry about it.
Terry Labonte spent his entire career saying very little, but the garage understood something long before the fans ever did. The quiet ones remember everything. For more than 3 decades, Labonte carried a mental ledger of every cheap shot, every corner stolen, and every moment when someone believed he would simply move aside because he refused to shout or make a scene. He accepted the contact, absorbed the hits, and kept racing, but the men who pushed him too far learned that silence was not weakness. Silence was a warning. Labonte was called the Ironman for his consistency, but the nickname also reflected how he handled conflict. He did not chase revenge with noise. He waited for the right lap, the right moment, and the right opportunity to give back exactly what he felt he was owed. Drivers who crossed him often discovered that he never forgot and never forgave lightly. They spoke of a cold stare, a steady voice, and an unshakable calm that made his anger more unsettling than any shouting match on pit road. Through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, a handful of rivals pushed him past the point of patience. They hit him when they should not have. They blocked him when the stakes were too high. They treated him like a man who would never retaliate, and they learned how wrong they were. These were the drivers who earned a permanent place in his memory and shaped the edges of his otherwise controlled career. And now, at 69, Terry Labonte finally reveals the 5 drivers he hated the most, the men who crossed a line he never forgot. Before we move into the list, we need to remember who Terry Labonte truly is. Terry Labonte was born in 1956 in Corpus Christi, Texas, into a family that treated racing as a way of life rather than a weekend hobby. He grew up around the sound of engines, the smell of fuel, and the discipline required to survive in a sport that rarely showed mercy. From a young age, he learned to keep his emotions controlled and his focus sharp. That calm exterior never changed, even as he climbed into the national spotlight and became one of the most respected drivers in NASCAR history. Labonte entered the Cup Series with a maturity far beyond his age. He did not chase attention. He did not stir drama. He built his reputation through skill, patience, and an almost unbreakable endurance that carried him through more than 800 starts. 2 championships proved his ability, but his consistency defined him. He won in the 80s, again in the 90s, and remained competitive long after many of his peers had faded. In a garage filled with explosive tempers and clashing personalities, he became the calm center that others underestimated at their own risk. His nickname, the Iron Man, came from his durability, but it also reflected the way he dealt with conflict. Labonte was not a political player. He was not a showman. He approached every rivalry with the same steady presence he carried on the track. When other drivers collided with him on purpose, when they blocked him with disrespect, or when they treated him like a man who would never push back, he stored those moments away. He remembered who crossed him, and he remembered why. Across 3 decades, the sport changed, the rules shifted, and the levels of aggression rose, yet Labonte remained the same, unshakable competitor. The drivers who underestimated him often learned that his silence did not equal surrender. It meant calculation. It meant patience. And eventually, it meant payback. To understand the list he is finally willing to reveal at 69, you have to understand the man who built a career without raising his voice. His rivals made noise. Labonte made statements. Number 5. Rusty Wallace. Rusty Wallace and Terry Labonte never needed a full-scale rivalry to create tension. It was already built into the way they raced. Wallace came from the school of aggressive short-track driving, where contact was not a possibility but an expectation. Labonte came from the school of precision and patience. When those 2 philosophies met on the same asphalt, something had to give, and more often than not, it was Labonte's rear bumper. Their clashes were never the headline-grabbing explosions that defined some rivalries of the era. Instead, they were sharp, subtle, and repeated enough to leave a mark that Labonte never forgot. Wallace had a habit of using his front bumper to create space where none existed, and Labonte viewed that as a violation of a code he lived by. He believed in earning position. Wallace believed in taking it. The difference between those two mindsets shaped every lap they shared in tight quarters. In the mid-90s, the tension grew. At Bristol, Richmond, and Martinsville, the pattern repeated itself. Labonte would race clean, Wallace would force the issue, and Labonte would climb out of the car afterward with the same controlled expression, refusing to escalate things verbally, but clearly storing the moment away. Other drivers exploded when Wallace hit them. Labonte simply went quiet. That silence made Wallace uneasy. He once admitted that Labonte was harder to read than any man in the garage. Wallace admired Labonte's talent, but admiration does not erase contact. Every unnecessary tap, every dive into the corner that pushed Labonte out of his rhythm carried weight. Labonte did not retaliate instantly, but the sport noticed how he began racing Wallace with a colder edge. He gave less room. He expected less respect. He treated Wallace as a man who had crossed a boundary one too many times. By the late stages of their careers, the rivalry never erupted into open conflict, but the distance between them was clear. Wallace pushed, Labonte endured, and each time it happened, the quiet driver from Texas hardened a little more. Rusty Wallace earned his place on this list, not through a single moment, but through a pattern that Terry Labonte never ignored. The quiet man does not forget. Number 4. Tony Stewart. Tony Stewart entered NASCAR with a reputation that spread faster than his victories. He was explosive, emotional, and unapologetically physical behind the wheel. Terry Labonte, by contrast, built his entire career on restraint. When those two forces met on track, it was not a matter of if they would clash, but when. Stewart believed pressure created opportunity. Labonte believed unnecessary pressure created chaos. That philosophical divide produced a tension that lasted years. Their early encounters were small, but pointed. Stewart would dive into corners with the confidence of a driver who assumed the field should part for him. Labonte did not part. He held his line, expected respect, and expected others to earn their way around him clean. Stewart often ignored that expectation. Each time the young driver pushed the limits, Labonte recognized exactly what was happening. He was being tested by a man who thrived on conflict. The moment that changed everything came during a series of run-ins at shorter tracks and road courses. Stewart used his front bumper to unsettle Labonte more than once, turning calculated pressure into contact that Labonte viewed as reckless. Labonte did not react publicly, did not speak with anger, and did not challenge Stewart in the garage. Instead, he grew colder. When Stewart tried to justify the aggression as part of racing, Labonte dismissed it with the kind of silence that carried more weight than any argument. Stewart eventually recognized that there were drivers in the field he could push, and there were drivers who would not bend. Labonte fit firmly into the second category. Their rivalry never turned into a full-scale feud because Labonte refused to participate in theatrics, but the respect between them slowly eroded. Stewart's disregard for boundaries placed him on a small and unwelcome list that Labonte kept to himself for years. By the time both men settled into the later phases of their careers, the tension never resolved. Stewart's aggression and Labonte's patience could not coexist without friction. Labonte understood exactly who Stewart was, and he judged him accordingly. Tony Stewart earned his position here by mistaking silence for permission. And the quiet man never gave permission. Number 3. Jeff Gordon. Jeff Gordon and Terry Labonte raced each other during one of the most competitive stretches the sport had ever seen. Gordon was young, fast, and fearless, a rising star who attacked every opening as if it belonged to him. Labonte was the veteran who raced with discipline and control. When Gordon pushed too hard, Labonte felt the imbalance immediately. Respect mattered to him. Momentum mattered to Gordon. That mix created a rivalry defined by sharp edges rather than loud words. Their tension never came from a single explosion. It came from a series of moments where Gordon treated track position like a prize to be taken at any cost. Labonte believed that Gordon's aggression crossed an unwritten line more than once. On intermediate tracks, Gordon would slide in front of Labonte with inches to spare, forcing him to lift. On short tracks, Gordon would lean on Labonte's rear bumper to move him just enough to break his rhythm. Each time it happened, Labonte filed it away. The pivotal moments arrived during the late 90s, when both drivers were fighting for wins and championships. At Bristol and Richmond, the battles turned sharp. Gordon pressed his advantage with youth and speed, while Labonte responded with the poise of a man who understood when he was being disrespected. He rarely confronted Gordon directly, but the look in his eyes after certain races said enough. He viewed Gordon not as an enemy, but as someone who failed to grasp the boundaries that held the garage together. Gordon admired Labonte's career, but admiration does not erase impact. Labonte believed Gordon's style lacked the patience and awareness that defined the older generation. When Gordon forced Labonte into evasive moves or disrupted his line for position he had not yet earned, Labonte took note. The coldness in his post-race demeanor was unmistakable. Labonte never said Gordon's name in anger, but he never hid the fact that Gordon had crossed him. Their rivalry cooled as Gordon matured, but the early years left a mark. Labonte respected Gordon's talent, yet he could not ignore the pattern that shaped their toughest battles. Jeff Gordon earned his place on this list by treating Labonte like a man who would always yield. The quiet man does not yield. Number 2. Kyle Busch. Kyle Busch entered the Cup Series with raw talent, fearless speed, and a willingness to force gaps that did not exist. Younger drivers often made mistakes, but Busch's mistakes came packaged with intensity. Terry Labonte, deep into the veteran years of his career, watched a new generation arrive with far less patience than the era he came from. Busch stood at the front of that wave, and their encounters revealed how differently the two men viewed respect on the racetrack. The earliest moments between them were not catastrophic, but they told a story. Busch used his bumper to move slower cars without hesitation, even when the situation did not call for it. Labonte noticed that pattern immediately. He believed there was a difference between racing hard and racing without awareness of consequences. Busch tended to blur that line, and Labonte absorbed the results more than once. When Busch turned across Labonte's nose at intermediate tracks or forced him into tight spaces at short tracks, the message felt familiar to Labonte, another young driver searching for dominance without understanding the cost. What made Busch stand out was the confidence he carried. He drove like he expected compliance from others. Labonte never offered compliance. He held his line, trusted his judgment, and expected younger drivers to respect the experience of men who had earned their place. When Busch failed to show that respect, Labonte grew noticeably colder. It was one of the few times in his career when he openly admitted frustration with a competitor. Their tension grew as Busch developed his aggressive identity. Labonte did not lash out, but he adjusted the way he raced Busch. He gave him less space, anticipated the overcommitment, and prepared for the contact that almost always came. Busch was talented, but talent did not excuse reckless choices. Labonte saw those choices clearly. By the time Labonte stepped away from full-time competition, the rivalry remained unresolved. Busch continued to rise, and Labonte left the sport with a firm opinion that the young star had earned a spot among the drivers who crossed him. Kyle Busch earns his place here for one reason. Terry Labonte saw him coming every time, and he never liked what he saw. Number 1. Dale Earnhardt. Dale Earnhardt and Terry Labonte shaped one of the most unforgettable contrasts in NASCAR history. Earnhardt was the intimidator, a driver who believed pressure was a tool and contact was part of the job. Labonte was the Ironman, a driver who believed respect created order and discipline created opportunity. When those two philosophies collided, the entire sport felt the impact. No rivalry defined Labonte's quiet anger more clearly than the one he carried toward Earnhardt. Their tension did not start with a single moment. It built slowly across years of tight battles where Earnhardt pushed the limits of acceptable contact. Labonte understood hard racing. He lived through an era defined by elbows-out driving and steel-to-steel combat. What he did not accept was unnecessary force, and Earnhardt crossed that threshold more than once. Each incident left Labonte a little colder, a little more convinced that Earnhardt valued position more than respect. Then came Bristol, 1995. Labonte passed Earnhardt clean for the win and took the checkered flag while sliding sideways from a hit that should never have been delivered. Labonte climbed out smiling, holding the trophy, but he never forgot how he earned it. 4 years later, the moment returned with even sharper edges. Bristol again. Labonte caught Earnhardt in the final laps, moved him clean, and prepared to finish the job. Earnhardt returned the contact with a harder shove that spun Labonte straight into the chaos he had tried to avoid. Earnhardt later offered his famous explanation. He did not mean to turn him. Labonte heard the words. He understood what they really meant. Earnhardt raced on instinct, and instinct did not include mercy. Labonte raced on principle, and principle did not allow him to ignore the pattern any longer. The rivalry never needed fists or screaming to prove its weight. It lived in the silence that followed their crashes, in the way Labonte looked at Earnhardt's car after each incident, and in the way he spoke in short, controlled sentences when reporters asked if he was angry. He never said the full truth. He did not have to. Dale Earnhardt earns the top position on this list because he forced Terry Labonte to confront the one opponent he could not outlast. The quiet man remembers the hardest hits. Dale Inman was not a rival on the track. He was a force in the garage. A crew chief with a reputation for discipline, precision, and a level of authority that few dared to challenge. Terry Labonte respected structure, but working with Inman meant facing a different kind of pressure. Inman demanded perfection every week, and he expected his drivers to carry themselves with the same intensity he brought to strategy and preparation. That expectation often pushed Labonte into uncomfortable territory. Their clashes never came from personal disagreement. They came from philosophy. Inman believed in controlling every detail. Labonte believed in adapting to what the car gave him. When the setups did not match Labonte's preferences, or when Inman pushed harder than the situation required, the tension rose. It was a quiet tension, but a sharp one, the kind that settled into the space between talent and authority. Inman challenged Labonte in ways other competitors never could. He questioned his feedback. He challenged his pace. He demanded adjustments not just from the car, but from the driver. Labonte admired the results Inman had achieved in his legendary career, yet admiration did not erase frustration. When the calls from the pit box went against Labonte's instincts, he held the dissatisfaction in silence. That silence spoke louder than any argument could. Their partnership produced strong performances, but it also revealed the limits of Labonte's patience. Inman's intensity made him one of the few people in the sport who could push Labonte toward real irritation. Drivers could hit him. Competitors could block him, but only a crew chief with Inman's authority could make Labonte feel cornered without ever touching his car. Dale Inman earns this special place not because he was an enemy, but because he was the one man inside Labonte's own camp who could truly test him. The quiet man endures many things, but he never forgets the pressure behind the wall. Terry Labonte's story was never built on volume. It was built on endurance. Through 3 decades, he outlasted louder drivers, hotter tempers, and more reckless challengers than most men could handle. He survived eras defined by contact-controlled chaos and the unspoken rule that respect had to be earned every single week. Labonte earned his through discipline and a refusal to let anyone dictate how he raced. The drivers on his list reflect the pressure points of a career built on quiet strength. Rusty Wallace pushed him with relentless physicality. Tony Stewart pressed him with raw aggression. Jeff Gordon tested him with youthful intensity. Kyle Busch challenged him with fearless confidence. And Dale Earnhardt forced him into moments that shaped his identity more than victories ever could. Each of them crossed a line that Labonte kept hidden from the public, but etched clearly in his memory. Even within his own camp, Dale Inman represented another kind of test, a reminder that conflict does not always come from outside. Labonte faced it all the same way. Calm, patient, unmoving. In the end, Terry Labonte never needed to raise his voice. His legacy rests in the way he carried himself when the pressure tightened and the contact grew sharper. He remembered every slight, every hit, every challenge to his principles, and he turned all of it into a career defined by durability and silent conviction. For a man who rarely spoke about grudges, revealing this list says more than any confrontation ever could. In a sport defined by noise, Terry Labonte proved that silence can be the most powerful answer of all.